Thank you very much, Brian. I thank everyone for the opportunity of being here today, but I'm not too sure that I'm all that pleased with the way you organised the agenda. You put yourself first, and then I followed the most eloquent contribution from Mr. President, and it would have been better if it had been the other way around, Brian, but thanks very much anyway. What I proposed to do today was firstly to give you a brief picture of racing in Australia, because although it is a very successful racing country, I'm not sure that it's always fully appreciated what an industry it is in Australia and how strong it is, particularly in the psychic of the Australian community. It's extremely much ingrained. And secondly, I'd like to have a look at a couple of the key factors, and one of them has been dealt with today briefly on 2 occasions, but everyone has different experiences with it, and that is the question of revenue and where we're going in the future in relation to the revenue structure in the industry, and the commonality of those problems has been shown already today by the speech by the President of France Gold, and that's been something that I think that we all have to face up to. The other thing is today we had another amazingly pertinent contribution from Akai about a bit of reality, and therefore I think that also brings together those 2 points, that we've got problems, we've got to be realistic about it, and as you said, Mr. President, we've got to be innovative, and we can take it to a certain point and we've got to keep going. There's no chance of relaxing in this sort of changing climate. I think one of the first strategies that Australia looked at in the last 10 years was the attempt to internationalise Australian racing, because I think it's fair to say that for a long, long while it was insular, but that strategy has worked, there's no doubt about that, and I'll deal with that a bit later. But in that changing environment, there had to be a change there. We're a long, long way away, particularly from the Northern Hemisphere, of course, and therefore it was something that the internationalisation of the industry in Australia was something that had to be tackled. And I think that the second point is related to the revenue issue. The key plank, I think, in Australia has been to give rewards to owners in order to keep them in the game, and secondly, to all the other participants in the industry. And I think that has been successful, but of course, there's no doubt in relative terms it's been extremely successful, but the challenges are still there in relation to that. I'm not going to go through too many, but just to give you a feeling of the nature of racing in Australia, I'll just give you a few statistical points. We do have an amazing number of race clubs and race courses. There are in fact 379 race clubs in Australia. It's a big country, but that's still a lot of race clubs. There are 353 race courses, and there are over 18,000 thoroughbred races in the country every year. And that takes place at 2,600 different race meetings. And about 2 million Australians attend the races at some stage during the year, and that's about 10% of our population. So that gives you that picture of how significant it is in the community. And of course we have large prize money, a total of 430 million each year, of which group races and listed races take about 124 million of that figure. So it has a very broad participant base where it involves probably 230,000 people, equating to 64,000 full-time jobs. Another point made by the President, that the issue of government relations, which is as significant in Australia, of course, as it is anywhere else, has that link back to the economy and, of course, back to the importance of employment. As you are probably aware, many of you, the biggest and best known racing event in Australia, of course, is the Melbourne Cup, which has now become very much an international race. The Cup now, which over the Cup Carnival, which goes for 4 days, attracts about 700,000 attendances, There are about 700,000 people attend that 4 days. And it ranks as Australia's largest annual event of any kind. And of course, during the carnival, you also have the Caulfield Cup and the Cox Plate. The Sydney Carnival in autumn is a superb carnival and is likely to get better and better. And last year, I think it was probably as good a carnival as there's been in Sydney for a long, long time, or this year, I'm sorry, and last autumn. But it's been, then all of the other states have extremely good race meetings. There's meetings in the winter more in Brisbane because of the weather. And overall, it's a national sport without any doubt. The thoroughbred sector is very successful. It comprises about 9,000 breeders, 800 stallions and 26,000 broodmares. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the key strategy has been to secure that strong and sustainable revenue stream which is essential in maintaining the sport of racing in Australia. And like most other jurisdictions, Australia is heavily reliant on wagering for its revenue. In the past, we had really a significant industry there in one sector. We had the monopoly parimutuels, or the totalisator operators, in each Australian state. And essentially it was a captive market. And the income generated from that came from the business partnership of the industry with those totalisator operators. But of course, as has been mentioned earlier today, the widespread uptake of internet betting over the past decade has changed the wagering environment, and probably in many ways in Australia it's changed it forever. You can control what's happening with the assistance of governments to some extent, but the environment has nevertheless changed and it's not likely to unravel back totally to where we were. And the cross-border competition that we've had, mostly from corporate bookmakers based in Australia and various offshore havens in the Pacific region, has been the real challenge. And as a consequence, the wagering revenue plateaued, and, or in some cases it declined, and jurisdictions missed out on receiving their fair share of the massive amounts wagered across Australia and international borders. And that was the problem, again, that was referred to earlier. Now, the Australian racing industry had to respond to that, and it did. And it's a federation of 6 states, and each state, of course, has a racing minister, and you have to get that support if you're going to go anywhere. And I think, as was said earlier today, not a lot of governments do fully understand the significance of the racing industry in terms of employment, in terms of the taxes that come out of it back to the government. It's not that well understood, and that is something that every jurisdiction has to work very, very hard on. The racing ministers were variously lobbied and engaged in the discussion about the direction we were going, and it was non-partisan. That was the big thing about it. The governments were of different political persuasions, but on this issue, which they don't manage to do on too many, they actually came together. That helped us a good deal. So what happened was that legislation was introduced in each state to make it an offence for any wagering service provider to publish or use race fields without the approval of the relevant thoroughbred racing controller, and then pay the appropriate fee. So what happened was there was what was called race fields legislation introduced in the states, saying, well, if you're going to publish this information, you can do that, but you can only do it by arrangement with the state racing authority to enter into agreements with them as to the use of those fields, and you're going to have to pay an appropriate price. The argument then started that they didn't want to do that, of course, because if you're getting a free ride for a long while, it's very hard to give it up. So the fight started. But the catalyst was a comprehensive victory to Racing New South Wales. They took action against the operators to obtain this agreement that I referred to, and secondly, an appropriate price. And In March of this year, the High Court upheld the validity of the legislation, and they secondly upheld the method that Racing New South Wales used to charge. There were two arguments, and there was a challenge by two operators. One was really about the validity of the legislation, and the other one was more directed to the method of charging. And in an historic decision, it was an enormous boost to racing. The High Court, which is no further appeal in Australia than the High Court of Australia, we did overcome the problem that for many years we used to then go to the Privy Council in England, but we actually grew up, and now we've got our own final court of appeal. But that decision gave us a sound foundation to go ahead. Now it doesn't solve all the problems, because there'll still be people who will be able to operate and pay the fee, and the dream of moving back to that parimutuel monopoly I don't think will come about. But at least this result does give some financial stability. We know where we're going, and as a result of it, the current minimum level of prize money for every Saturday race in Sydney and Melbourne is around €65,000, which is an enormous incentive for people to stay in racing. It gives them it's a greatly attractive method for them to engage in that social activity and the thrill that only racing can give you. In addition to that, of course, that's the key revenue, but there's all those others. There's the club memberships, there's the attendances, all the things you know all about. And then the other issue, which has already been touched on, the big one has been the broadcasting rights. The industry in Australia, while it was able to get together on other things, it did not come together on the issue of aggregation of our broadcasting rights. And that's where all the independent assessments that have been done indicate that, of course, if you don't aggregate it, you're dealing with around the whole of the main racing areas, you're not going to get the value that you deserve. Those negotiations are going on at the moment, particularly between Racing New South Wales and Racing Victoria, and I think those of us here who are aware of those can only hope that they come to a proper result from the point of view of maximising the value. And as we move into those other areas, I mean, Brian made the point about the Sony Walkman. We have to get onto every method we can through the internet, through broadcasting, through all of the new technologies. That's the challenge, and it's just not something that we can relax about. We've got to keep working at it, be as innovative as we can, and do something about it. I think that the growing interest in racing in Australia has been certainly helped by the internationalisation aspect. That's the second part of the strategy. And that came about through some visionary people at the VRC, the Victoria Racing Club, which is the largest of the clubs in Melbourne. And they deserve to be commended enormously for what they did there, because it has turned the corner in that sense. The interest in the industry in Australia has been helped greatly by that internationalisation, and it works both ways. The Australian horses have had great success over the years in Europe, and now we've reached the stage where we wonder whether an Australian horse, or when they will win the next Melbourne Cup, and it might be a fair way off. Last year it was France. A couple of years before it was, of course, Japan, and we've got to live with that and be grateful for it in another sense. So I think that those are the issues which faced us. Firstly, the isolation, because of the geographical isolation, and the need to move out of that and internationalise. We've done that. And for the time being, I think we've had a victory in relation to that other issue, that is of the revenue and the betting aspects, but you're going to have to be ever vigilant in that, and I don't think there's any point where you can sit back and say we've totally solved that problem. That's a fairly quick picture, I know, but I actually did cut a bit out because we're running a bit behind time, and anyway, I don't think you wanted to hear much more. That's all that was really all that relevant. So I thank you all for your attention and wish you all the best, and I think the speech of the President, as I said, indicates to us how common the problems are. we all seem to have the same problem in one way or another. Thank you all very much.